Nearly 5 weeks after Nolan Wells disappeared on Horn Island, investigators still have not publicly answered the most basic question in this case. What happened to Nolan during his final known hours? Now, a newly released 22-page report, photographs gathered from people who say they were on Horn Island that day, GPS information, witness statements, and a controversial enhanced recording of a call from the boat are putting the timeline under renewed scrutiny. And at the center of everything is a remarkably small window of time. Nolan Wells was reportedly last seen at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The boat that carried him to Horn Island left without him at approximately 4:31. That leaves roughly 90 minutes. 90 minutes that could hold the answer to what happened to an 18-year-old college athlete who went to an Independence Day gathering with friends and never came home. But before examining the new evidence, there is something important to understand. No one has been charged with causing Nolan Wells' death. Authorities have not publicly identified a suspect. And despite the enormous amount of speculation circulating online, the official cause and manner of Nolan's death have not been publicly established. That distinction matters because this case has increasingly become a mixture of confirmed evidence, disputed accounts, incomplete forensic findings, social media theories, and even fabricated documents. Separating those categories may be the only way to understand what we actually know. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He was a graduate of Ocean Springs High School and a football player at Southwest Mississippi Community College. On July 3rd, according to his mother, Christine Wansley, Nolan cooked dinner for his parents before leaving to stay at a friend's house. Before he left, he hugged and kissed his mother. The next morning, July 4th, Nolan joined friends for a trip to Horn Island, an uninhabited barrier island several miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. GPS information later obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources indicated that the boat departed the Ocean Springs area at approximately 9:56 that morning. It reached Horn Island at approximately 11:14. Hundreds of people were reportedly visiting the island that holiday weekend. At first, nothing appeared unusual about Nolan's trip. There were boats. There were groups of young people. There was swimming and socializing. It looked like a 4th of July gathering similar to many others along the Gulf Coast. But sometime during the afternoon, something changed. Authorities have said Nolan was last seen around 3 o'clock. The friends who traveled with him have also said they last saw him around that time. According to one account publicly described by Jackson County Chancery Judge Ashley Cole, whose stepson Warren Hudson was among Nolan's friends, Nolan decided to remain on Horn Island and return to the mainland with another group. Warren Hudson would later publicly explain that Nolan wanted to remain because he had been spending time with a girl. If that account is correct, then Nolan voluntarily stayed behind while his friends left because their boat was experiencing mechanical problems. But Nolan's family has questioned that explanation. Their concern is not simply that Nolan remained on an island. It is what apparently remained with the boat. Nolan's phone eventually returned to the mainland. His car keys returned. Nolan did not. His mother later tracked his phone and discovered it was back on land. She has also said that some material on the phone appeared to have been deleted. That does not by itself prove a crime occurred. But to Nolan's parents, it raised an obvious question. If Nolan intentionally planned to stay behind and later travel home with someone else, why would he leave without his phone and car keys? There is another disputed part of the story. Sheriff John Ledbetter has said investigators interviewed people who reported that Nolan chose to stay behind. But attorney Ben Crump, representing Nolan's family, has said another witness indicated that Nolan had actually intended to return with the friends who brought him to the island. Those two possibilities lead in very different directions. And that is why the time between approximately 3 o'clock and 4:31 has become so important. A newly released report from the United Cajun Navy now puts that gap directly under the microscope. The United Cajun Navy participated in the search for Nolan after he disappeared. Weeks later, the organization compiled a 22-page document containing information it had received from members of the public. The report includes photographs, screenshots taken from videos, GPS coordinates, annotations, social media statements, and a working timeline. But there is an important warning attached to it. United Cajun Navy Vice President Brian Trasher has emphasized that this is not an official law enforcement report. The organization could not independently verify the metadata or authenticity of every image or every claim it received. Some of the material came from social media users who said they were present on Horn Island, and the report explicitly does not determine criminal or civil responsibility. In other words, the document should not be treated as proof that anyone committed a crime. Its value is different. It organizes information, it compares timelines, and most importantly, it exposes the places where information is still missing. One of those places is the 90-minute period before the boat departed. The report asks essentially the same question Nolan's family has been asking. What happened between the last reported sighting of Nolan and the moment his friends left Horn Island without him? The boat itself provides another piece of the puzzle. According to previously released GPS data, it departed Horn Island around 4:31 in the afternoon. It later entered the Fort Bayou area at approximately 5:52 and reached the dock around 6:06. Later that evening, the boat traveled to the Fort Bayou boat launch and was eventually transported over land to its owner's residence. But before the boat left Horn Island, the group had a serious problem. The vessel was taking on water. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, someone aboard contacted Sea Tow, a private marine towing company. The recording of that call was later released. The caller can be heard explaining that the boat was sinking and requesting assistance. The dispatcher asks questions about the vessel's position and condition. At one point, the dispatcher asks whether everyone is okay. The caller indicates that the people aboard are okay. That call became one of the most scrutinized pieces of evidence in the entire case, not because of the conversation between the caller and dispatcher, but because of voices in the background. An audio engineer later enhanced portions of the recording. After the enhanced version began circulating, some listeners claimed they could hear statements suggesting the people in the background were talking about Nolan as though something had already happened to him. Those interpretations spread rapidly across social media, but this is where extreme caution is required. The FBI has not publicly confirmed those interpretations. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has not publicly authenticated any alleged background statement as proof of a crime. Audio enhancement can make quiet sounds easier to hear, but it can also create an environment where listeners begin interpreting ambiguous sounds according to what they already expect to hear. That phenomenon is especially dangerous in a case where millions of people are actively searching for an explanation. So the enhanced recording is important. But it is not, at least based on the public evidence available today, a confession. It does not prove that Nolan was dead at the time of the call, and it does not establish who is speaking in every background segment. What it does accomplish is something more limited but still significant. It provides investigators with another timestamp. Around 4 o'clock, the boat was in trouble. The people aboard were attempting to obtain assistance, and Nolan's last publicly established sighting was approximately an hour earlier. Then, at 4:31, the boat departed. The question remains, where was Nolan during that period? And who, if anyone, saw him? There is another reason that question is so puzzling. Horn Island was not empty that afternoon. Reports indicate there may have been roughly 200 people in the area. Yet investigators have not publicly produced a witness who says they saw Nolan enter the water. No public witness has described seeing him drown. And no publicly confirmed witness account has explained his movements from the last sighting until his disappearance. That absence does not prove foul play. People can disappear surprisingly quickly near water, particularly in chaotic recreational environments. But it explains why Nolan's family refuses to accept a simple explanation without more evidence. Hours passed before his mother realized something was seriously wrong. At approximately 11 o'clock that night, one of Nolan's friends contacted the United States Coast Guard. The Coast Guard later said that particular call did not require Coast Guard assistance. At approximately 11:07, Nolan's mother received a call from Warren Hudson. She then began trying to locate her son. The situation became even more confusing when different location services appeared to provide different information. Nolan's Snapchat location appeared to point one way. Life 360 indicated his phone was on the mainland. Eventually, the phone was recovered. Nolan was still missing. The next morning, Nolan's father and his football coach traveled toward Horn Island to search. Authorities and volunteer groups joined the effort. The Coast Guard sent aviation resources. The United Cajun Navy deployed search personnel. The search continued into July 6th. At approximately 8:45 that morning, authorities received word that a body had been discovered in the water near the northwestern end of Horn Island. A National Park Service ranger had found it. The body was later identified as Nolan Wells. At first, investigators said drowning appeared to be a possibility and stated that they did not then suspect foul play. But that did not end the case. It intensified it. Nolan's parents said they were hearing conflicting accounts. They wanted answers about his phone. They wanted to understand why he had supposedly remained on the island without his belongings. And they wanted to know exactly how he entered the water. The family retained civil rights attorney Ben Crump and commissioned an independent autopsy. The findings did not provide a simple answer. Forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell listed both cause and manner of death as undetermined pending further investigation. He found no fractures and no clear deep tissue injuries. The report noted red discoloration near the back of Nolan's skull, but described its meaning as inconclusive and requiring further investigation. There were also major limitations. Nolan's body had undergone decomposition, and because the state had already performed the first autopsy, several organs and anatomical structures had already been removed before the independent examination. That is not necessarily unusual after an initial autopsy, but it limited what the second pathologist could determine. For example, the second examination could not independently determine whether water had entered the lungs before death because the lungs were no longer available in their original condition. The independent pathologist, therefore, could not rule out non-accidental factors. But that statement is sometimes misunderstood online. Not ruling out foul play is not the same as concluding that foul play occurred. The independent autopsy did not determine that Nolan was murdered. It determined that the available evidence was insufficient to establish exactly how he died. And now another complication has emerged. A document presented online as Nolan Wells' toxicology report began circulating across social media. Mississippi authorities say it is fake. Commissioner Sean Tyndall publicly warned about fabricated information being circulated in the case, including material possibly produced with artificial intelligence. The actual state medical findings remain sealed. According to officials, the evidence will eventually be reviewed as part of a grand jury process. That means one of the most important sources of information about Nolan's death is still unavailable to the public. What did the official autopsy determine? What does the legitimate toxicology analysis show? Can forensic evidence establish drowning? Can it establish another mechanism of death? Or has decomposition made a definitive answer impossible? Until that evidence is released or presented through the legal process, anyone claiming to know exactly how Nolan died is moving beyond the publicly confirmed facts. Meanwhile, the online reaction to Nolan's death has created an entirely separate criminal investigation. Federal authorities have charged 3 people with making threats against individuals connected to the case. One Illinois man is accused of threatening a witness and members of another family. An Ohio woman is accused of repeatedly making bomb threats against government offices in Mississippi. A California man is accused of sending a bomb threat to a judge with family connections to someone involved in the July 4th outing. Authorities say none of these defendants appear to have known Nolan, his family, or the boating group. Their alleged actions are not evidence about how Nolan died. Instead, they demonstrate how quickly an unresolved investigation can become dangerous when speculation turns into certainty. The irony is striking. At the same time, investigators are trying to determine what actually happened to Nolan Wells. Fabricated documents, AI-generated material, and threats are creating additional layers of noise around the evidence. And that makes the new United Cajun Navy report particularly interesting. Not because it solves the case. It does not. Not because every photograph inside it has been verified. They have not. But because it pulls the investigation back toward the timeline. 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 4:31. Those 3 times may ultimately matter more than thousands of social media posts. At approximately 3, Nolan is reportedly last seen. Around 4, the troubled boat is communicating with Sea Tow. At 4:31, that boat leaves Horn Island without him. Somewhere inside that sequence lies a fundamental question. Was Nolan alive and safely socializing on the island when the boat departed? If he was, who saw him afterward? Who was the person or group he supposedly expected to travel home with? Did investigators identify and interview them? If he intended to leave with his original group instead, why did he not board the boat? And at what point did his phone and keys become separated from him? Those questions do not accuse anyone. They are simply the unanswered gaps created by the publicly available timeline. Investigators have already interviewed dozens of witnesses. The FBI has assisted in examining digital evidence. Authorities have requested original photographs, videos, and eyewitness accounts from anyone on Horn Island that day. And prosecutors have indicated that the completed investigation will ultimately be presented to a grand jury. That process could be crucial because the most important evidence may not be a dramatic recording or a single photograph. It may be digital, cell phone location data, original message records, Snapchat data, boat GPS information, metadata from photographs and videos, communication records between the people on Horn Island, and timestamps that allow investigators to reconstruct where Nolan and others were minute by minute. The new 22-page report provides a public framework, but law enforcement potentially has access to evidence the public does not. That is why the final answers may look very different from the theories dominating social media today. There are currently at least 3 broad possibilities that the public evidence must be tested against. The first is an accident. Nolan could have remained on the island, entered the water later, encountered difficulty, and drowned without anyone realizing what was happening. The second is an accident involving circumstances or interactions that have not yet been fully explained publicly. And the third is some form of non-accidental event. At this stage, none of those possibilities has been conclusively established in the public record. A responsible investigation has to test all of them. The absence of obvious traumatic injuries does not automatically establish drowning, but uncertainty in an autopsy does not establish homicide either. That uncomfortable middle ground is exactly where the Nolan Wells investigation remains. And perhaps that is why the 90-minute gap matters so much. For weeks, attention has moved from one controversial detail to another. The phone, deleted messages, the boat, the sea tow call, the enhanced background audio, the autopsy, the missing anatomical structures after the first examination, the alleged witnesses, the photographs, the fake toxicology report, the threats. But almost every one of those issues eventually leads back to the same question. Where was Nolan Wells between approximately 3 o'clock and 4:31 on July 4th? If investigators can reconstruct that period with reliable witnesses and digital evidence, the mystery may become much smaller. If they cannot, those 90 minutes may remain the most important blank space in the entire case. United Cajun Navy has now delivered its report to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the district attorney, and Nolan's parents. Law enforcement continues its investigation. The official medical evidence remains out of public view, and no one has been charged with causing Nolan's death. For Nolan's family, that means the central question remains exactly where it began. Their 18-year-old son traveled to Horn Island with friends. His phone and keys returned to the mainland. He did not. 2 days later, his body was found in the water. Everything that happened between those points is what investigators now have to explain. And until the evidence can do that, the final 90 minutes of Nolan Wells' July 4th trip remain one of the most important unanswered parts of this case.